شكرا فخامة.
Thank you, Mr. President. In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, Mr. President, Miroslav Lajcak, President of the General Assembly, allow me at the outset to congratulate you for assuming the presidency of the 72nd session of the United Nations General Assembly. I wish you all the success in carrying out your duties. I also seize this opportunity to express the utmost appreciation to Mr. Peter Thompson, the President of the 71st session of the UN General Assembly, who has most ably overseen the work of the session. Mr. President, every time we meet at this august body, we rekindle the hopes and aspirations of the peoples whom we are honored to represent and serve, to provide them with peace and development. New generations look up to us to realize their dreams for a decent life within a fair international order, a global order that can face challenges such as climate change, natural disasters, diseases, and epidemics, as well as other man-made crises such as wars, terrorism, and the huge discrepancies in the distribution of resources and development opportunities. It is evident that the purposes and principles of the United Nations are still valid as a basis for a world that offers everyone an opportunity to benefit from the great strides in scientific advancement, economic development, as well as the data revolution which has brought societies ever more closer in an unprecedented manner. These developments offer great potential for establishing a fair and secure international order that is based on the right to development, freedom, and progress, and open interactions between people. In Egypt, we adamantly believe in the values of the United Nations and the purposes of its charter. We have great confidence that realizing these values is not only possible, but rather an obligation and a necessity. Egypt's long-standing involvement with the UN, both as a founding member of the United Nations that has been elected to the Security Council 6 times, and the 7th largest contributor to peacekeeping operations worldwide, this involvement bears witness to our constant strive to build a world that is worthy of the aspirations of our children and grandchildren, to live in freedom, dignity, security, and prosperity. However, the responsibility that we bear necessitates that we be frank in saying that this world that we seek, which is possible, still remains unfortunately far from reality. We are still unable to prevent armed conflict or confront terrorism or disarm nuclear weapons and address the structural imbalances in the international economic order, which have widened the gap between the developed and developing worlds. Based on the experiences of the African and Arab regions, I can state with a clear conscience that these experiences summarize the current crisis of the international order and its inability to deliver on the goals of this organization. The Arab region, Egypt's civilizational and cultural milieu, has today become an epicenter for some of the most vicious civil conflicts in recent human history. It is the most vulnerable region to the dangers posed by terrorism. 1 out of every 3 refugees in the world today is an Arab, and the Mediterranean Sea has become a conduit for irregular migrants from Asian and African states who are fleeing the scourge of civil strife as well as the despair of economic and social hardships. This is reflected in the Arab Regional Report on Multidimensional Poverty conducted by the League of Arab States in collaboration with the United Nations. The report will be issued tomorrow. As Egypt's geographical home, Africa lies at the heart of Egypt's foreign policy, for it is in Africa that our historic roots lie, and it is from Africa that we derive the pride in our identity and our deep sense of belonging. this continent has also become subject to the same security threats facing the Arab region, and constitutes a major example of the crisis in the current international economic order, which perpetuates poverty and economic disparity. This global order bears a major responsibility in the economic, political, and social crises that threaten international peace and stability, rendering any discussion on sustainable development goals just words without evidence from reality. Mr. President, Egypt is therefore encircled by the most dangerous crises in the world. It is our destiny to navigate confidently through these unprecedented dangers, relying on an ambitious development strategy based on radical and economic reforms. The reforms aim, before anything, at empowering the youth, who represent the majority of the population, not only in Egypt, but also in most of the societies of the Arab countries and in the developing world. In a world that is interconnected, complex, and full of challenges that cannot be confronted by any country alone, regardless of its capabilities, it is natural for Egypt's ambitious development plans to correlate with an active foreign policy. Such a strategy of foreign policy is guided by the long-established moral principles ingrained in our heritage and culture, and abides by the legal principles of the international system which Egypt has actively participated in formulating. It is based on a vision to address the shortcomings that have prevented the realization of the objectives of the United Nations. Our vision is based on the following 5 main principles and priorities. First, the only possible solution to the crises afflicting the Arab region is through upholding persistently the notion of the modern nation state, which is based on the principles of citizenship, equality, rule of law, and human rights, and thereby defeating any attempt of relapsing into doctrinal, sectarian, ethnic, or tribal loyalties. The path towards reform inevitably passes through the realization of the nation state and cannot be built on its demise. This principle, in summary, lies at the core of Egypt's foreign policy, and it is the foundation on which we base our positions in addressing the crises in our region. With regards to Syria, we believe there would be no salvation for Syria except through a consensual political solution amongst all Syrians, at the core of which is the preserving the unity of the Syrian state, the maintenance of its institutions, and broadening the political and social base to include all factions of society, and to decisively confront terrorism until it is defeated. And the way to this solution is through the UN-led negotiation process, which enjoys strong support from Egypt, support as strong as the rejection with which we face any attempt to manipulate the tragedy in Syria to establish international or regional zones of influence, or to carry out the subversive policies of some regional parties whose practices have caused great suffering to our region over the past few years. It is now high time for a final and decisive confrontation with these practices. Similarly, we believe that a political settlement is the only viable solution to the crisis in Libya. Libya continues to face attempts to dismantle the state and turn it into an open field for tribal conflict, a field of operations for terrorist organizations. Here, I clearly emphasize that Egypt will not allow the continuation of attempts to tamper with the unity and integrity of the Libyan state or to undermine the capabilities of the Libyan people. We will continue to work diligently with the United Nations to achieve a political settlement based on the Sukhayrat Agreement, which is inspired by the recommendations agreed upon by the Libyans. The recommendations that came out of their consecutive meetings in Cairo during the last months. The aim is to end the political stalemate and to revive the settlement process in the country. The same aforementioned logic applies to Egypt's strategy in Iraq and Yemen. The only way to overcome the crises is a unified, capable, and just modern nation state, and it's the way to realize the aspirations of the Arab people. Second, It is time for a comprehensive and final settlement to the longest-standing crisis in the Arab region, namely the question of Palestine, which is a clear depiction of the international community's inability to implement a long series of United Nations and Security Council resolutions. The closure of this chapter through a fair settlement based on established international norms and establishing an independent Palestinian state along the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital is a necessary precondition for the entire region to transit into a phase of stability and development. This is also necessary to restore the credibility of the United Nations and the international order. Without a doubt, achieving peace will eliminate one of the main excuses that terrorism has been manipulating to justify its proliferation in the region. And it will guarantee dignified life for the peoples of the region. It is time to permanently overcome the barrier of hatred forever. I would like to underscore here that the Arabs still extend their hands in peace. Egypt's experience proves that peace is possible and is indeed a realistic objective that we should all continue to pursue with all seriousness. Allow me, Mr. President, here, before I continue my statement, to steer off script for a moment and direct a call to everyone who's concerned by this issue. And my first audience is the Palestinian people. I tell the Palestinian people it's important, extremely important, to unite behind a goal and to overcome the differences and not to lose opportunities, and to be ready to accept coexistence with the other, with Israelis in safety and security, and to achieve stability and security for all. And I say and direct my call to the Israeli people, we have an excellent experience in Egypt in peace with you for longer than 40 years. We can repeat this experience and this excellent step once again. The peace and the security of the Israeli citizen, together with the peace and security of the Palestinian citizen.
نداء إليكم أن تقف.
My call is to stand behind your political leadership and support it, and to not hesitate. Do not hesitate. I am addressing Israeli public opinion. Do not hesitate. We are all with you for the success of this attempt, and this opportunity might not repeat itself. My other call is to all peace-loving nations and stability-loving nations, all Arab states, support this excellent endeavor. And to all the nations of the world, stand behind this attempt that, if successful, will change the face of history. And I address the American leadership, the American president. We have an opportunity to write a new page in humanity's history to achieve peace in this region. Third, it is impossible to envisage a future for the regional or international order without a definitive and comprehensive confrontation with terrorism. This should be approached in a manner that eradicates terrorism and eliminates its roots and causes, in addition to openly challenging any party that supports or finances terrorism or offers it political or media channels or safe havens. In all candidness, there is no room for any serious discussion on the credibility of a system that applies a double standard, a system that fights terrorism while tolerating its supporters and engaging them in discussions on how to eliminate a threat that they created in the first place. In order to be truthful and faithful to our peoples, members of different international alliances must answer pertinent questions that we are raising. Out of devotion to our people, answers are usually avoided by those who prefer duplicity to attain political interests, narrow interests, at the demise of states and the expense of bloodshed. We will not allow our people's sacrifices to be lost in vain under any circumstance. We in the Muslim world must face our reality and work together to rectify misconstrued notions which have become an ideological pretext for terrorism and its destructive discourse. And as you may recall, Egypt has launched an initiative to rectify religious discourse in order to revive the true and tolerant values of Islam. Egypt's religious institutions are currently engaged in this process in coordination with relevant international entities worldwide. Egypt, which is currently engaged in an unrelenting battle to eradicate terrorism from its territory, is committed to track, confront, and eliminate terrorism decisively wherever it exists. It is evident that confronting terrorism has been at the forefront of Egypt's priorities during its membership of the Security Council in 2016-2017. It was also our priority during our chairmanship of the Counterterrorism Committee. This was not only in defense of Egypt's future, but in defense of the future of the international community as a whole. Fourth, the elimination of the root causes of international crises and sources of threat to international stability necessitates the operationalization of the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities between members of the international community. This will allow narrowing the economic and social gaps between developed and developing nations. How can the United Nations, the Agenda 2030, and the Sustainable Development Goals have any credibility when the international economic order is in itself responsible for augmenting disparities in a manner inconsistent with the values of justice and equality? How can there be an opportunity for less developed countries, no matter how determined they are, to implement fundamental economic reforms to address the mismanagement of their resources without addressing the imbalances in the international economic order? This requires involving developing countries more in the structure of international economic governance and facilitating their access to easier financing as well as markets and technology transfer. Fifth, settling disputes in our world today can only be achieved through respect for the principles of international law and negotiation on the basis of legal, historic, and moral principles, as well as respect of sovereignty of states and the principle of non-intervention in internal affairs. After more than 7 decades have elapsed since the establishment of the United Nations, force and zero-sum games cannot be the means to realize interests. Today's world is based on mutual interdependence among nations, where significant horizons for cooperation and understanding exist to achieve common interests for all. Based on the aforementioned principles, Egypt has been at the forefront of countries that have been keen on initiating the Nile Basin Initiative in 1999. We pursued the conclusion of a trilateral agreement between Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia to address the Renaissance Dam issue from a cooperative perspective in a manner that establishes a clear legal framework to manage the issue in accordance with international law and established norms. And based on the well-established rules governing relations between states sharing basins of transboundary rivers all over the world. This agreement remains the legal framework that can be a reflection of the logic of cooperation and sharing between the three parties, as long as good faith persists. This is particularly important to implement the agreement in light of the pressing time. We must not lose the opportunity of presenting a successful model for the management of relations between three sisterly countries in the Nile Basin. Mr. President, in conclusion, our meeting today in this august body is an opportunity for truthful self-reflection, where we should admit the shortcomings of the international system to deliver the noble objectives and aspirations it was set up to realize. It is an opportunity to renew our commitment to establish a more equitable international order, given that the attainment of justice globally remains a necessary condition to confront the immense challenges that impact our world today and that threaten the credibility of our international system. The humanitarian tragedy facing the Rohingya minority in Myanmar represents another reason that reminds the international community of its moral obligations, let alone its legal responsibilities as reflected in the UN Charter. We must promptly work towards a lasting solution that ends the plight of Palestinians and addresses the root causes of the crisis, which has become a threat to regional security and the stability of neighboring countries. Let us move together to empower the people of this world to regain control of their destinies and to explore new horizons of cooperation between members of the international community. Let us transcend the vicious circle of narrow interests and the futile logic of power politics to the broader horizons of common human interests and cooperation among all. Let us be true to ourselves and end all polarizing policies. The world today is in dire need of upholding our common human interests. It is incumbent upon all states to strive to further relations with all partners without offending anyone. This, Mr. President, was Egypt's message that I have conveyed to you today, explicitly and clearly. I am full of hope that our joint efforts during the upcoming period will succeed in realizing a better world, which is more secure, stable, and prosperous. Thank you. Long live Egypt, long live Egypt, long live Egypt. May the peace of God be upon you.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President